Chapter 13, the Endocrine System, Screencast 1. Now, Chapter 13 is focusing on the second of the major control systems that we have in our body. Chapter 11, which was part of Unit 2, was the nervous system. Now we're focusing on the chemical control, and together between the nervous system and the endocrine system, that is what's responsible for controlling the body, maintaining homeostasis, and so on. Now, when we look at the endocrine system, what we want to keep in mind here is it's a collection of very specialized cells and tissues, and what these tissues actually do, they secrete hormones. Now, there's different types of glands. We have endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Exocrine glands have a duct. So that was something we talked about previously in Chapter 4, and it ends there. So we're now moving on to endocrine glands. These are ductless organs. And what they do, they actually secrete their hormones either into the blood, lymph, or interstitial fluid. Now, hormones are specific chemical messengers that are secreted by endocrine glands, and they circulate within the bloodstream. Now, they have a target cell, and what that is, that's the specific cell in the body that they are designed to actually work on. And what is especially important is these chemical messengers have a specific receptor. So this concept of specificity. So let's say epinephrine, which is a hormone, it will bind to a adrenergic receptor, which is specific to epinephrine. Insulin cannot bind to this receptor because it's for epinephrine. Now here, a couple of things that I want to point out are the general endocrine organs of the body and the corresponding hormones that they produce. Now, the hypothalamus, we saw this previously, it's the bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and it's also a bridge to the autonomic nervous system. So what the hypothalamus is going to do is basically release either inhibiting hormones or releasing hormones, and they're going to act upon the pituitary. The pituitary is known as the master gland, and what we see here are a host of hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary to from the posterior pituitary. We have the adrenal glands, okay, and that is two separate areas responsible for two different sets of hormones. The kidneys, we don't often think of the kidney as an endocrine organ, but it does have an endocrine function associated with it, as do the ovaries and the testes. If we look at the intestine also, there's an endocrine role here, and the pancreas. Now, keep in mind here, the pancreas is primarily an exocrine organ, not an endocrine organ, but it plays a very endocrine function with the hormones that are released by the pancreas, which are glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. If we look at the heart, thymus, parathyroid glands. So what I want you to think about here, there are a lot of endocrine organs in the body, and their secretions are critical for homeostasis. Now, what we want to look at here are the primary characteristics of the endocrine system. Now, because they circulate within the bloodstream, hormones have access to pretty much every cell within our body. Now, hormones have a specific target cell. Now, only specific cells have receptors for specific hormones. Another really important thing here is endocrine control is much slower than the nervous system. And also, keep in mind, the two interact with each other, okay? Now, when we look at the two different types of hormones, this is probably the most important difference that we find. It's whether or not they're water-soluble or lipid-soluble. So we're first going to look at how steroid hormones work. Now, all of the steroids are derived from cholesterol. So let's kind of take a look at this overall function and how they play. So there's the capillary, all right? Now, the steroid would have had to travel in the bloodstream with the help of a protein carrier because, once again, we know that lipids don't travel very well in an aqueous environment. Now, when we look at a steroid hormone, because it's lipid soluble, the receptor is actually going to be inside of the cell. Now here we're actually looking at a receptor for this particular hormone, which is in the nucleus. So we think of that as a nuclear receptor. Now, once it binds to a receptor, it actually forms a complex. Now, what's going to happen within the nucleus, this hormone receptor complex is actually going to attach to DNA. And when that happens, it's actually going to activate a specific gene. Now, I'm sure you've heard the term genes before. Now, a gene is the directions to basically produce a particular protein. So then we'll look at that DNA, we'll see the transcription into messenger RNA, and that messenger RNA will go out to the ribosomes, and we will see it produced. Okay, so protein synthesis, and then this new protein is going to have some impact on overall cell activity, okay, because of the protein that was coded for by that particular gene. Now, what's really important here when we talk about steroid hormones, we want to remember that they're relatively slow acting. Non-steroidal hormones will work relatively quickly. So let's take a look at non-steroid hormones. But before we get going on here, I want to give you an idea of what hormones we primarily consider to be steroids or lipid soluble. Those are going to be steroids themselves, eicosanoids, which are more like local chemical messengers, and then thyroid hormone. So if it's not one of those three, if it's not a steroid, if it's not thyroid hormone or an eicosanoid, it is a non-steroid hormone. So there's a lot more of non-steroid hormones than steroids. Now, they are water soluble, so they do not require any assistance as they're moving through the bloodstream. Now, they can't get into the cell because they're water soluble, not lipid soluble. So the receptor for non-steroid hormones are membrane bound. So we can actually see that. Now, another term that you might see for the hormone is the first messenger. Now, generally what's going to happen here is an activation of proteins. So that's really what's going to happen. Here, this particular chemical messenger or non-steroidal hormone is actually activating what we call a kinase cascade. It's using a substance known as cyclic AMP, and this is actually what we refer to as a second messenger. Now, that second messenger is going to result in the activation of an enzymatic cascade, and the final product at the end of this cascade is what will eventually alter cell activity. Now, these are significantly faster acting. So typically we're going to look at seconds to minutes in how long it's going to take for a non-steroid hormone to work. Now, if we look at another mechanism in which hormones are going to work, it's generally through negative feedback mechanisms. And so these are the ones that are related to homeostasis. So what we're going to look at, the endocrine gland serves as the control center. The hormone will actually act as the pathway between the control center and the effectors, and the target tissues or organs are the actual effectors. So let's kind of take a look at here, and we've seen this before, okay? We have a particular controlled variable, and I'm going to use blood glucose level as an example. So here we're going to see blood glucose levels decrease. The endocrine gland is the pancreas, and that is going to be the control center. Now here, the hormone is going to be glucagon. Okay, so glucagon is responsible for restoring or increasing blood glucose levels back to the set point. And so glucagon will actually result in glycogen being broken down and other mechanisms that result in an increase in overall blood glucose levels. So here we see the reversal of the initial change. Here, blood glucose was too low. Now we're back to the set point where it's supposed to be.